The echoing crack of gunfire split the evening air as Josephine Fletcher crumpled to the ground, her gloved hand clutching at the bleeding wound in her side. The sun hung low on the horizon, painting the Nevada sky in hues of amber and crimson that matched the blood seeping between her fingers and staining the dusty road beneath her. Through a veil of pain, she watched the three bandits mount their horses, her father's prized strongbox secured to the saddle of their leader, a man whose scarred face she would never forget. The year was 1875, and the promise of a new life in Tonopah Junction had just erupted into a nightmare on the lonely stretch of road 5 miles outside town. "Should we finish her?" one of the masked men called, his voice muffled behind the bandana that concealed his features. The leader, the scarred one, shook his head. "She ain't got long anyway. Let the desert take her. No sense wastin' another bullet." With cruel laughter trailing behind them like a dust cloud, the bandits galloped away, leaving Josephine bleeding and alone as darkness began to claim the land. Her traveling trunk lay broken open beside the overturned wagon, her possessions scattered across the hard-packed earth like fallen leaves. The 2 draft horses that had pulled her wagon were gone, stolen along with everything else of value she'd owned. She tried to rise, only to collapse back to the ground as pain lanced through her body. They'd shot her once in the side, but she'd also been pistol-whipped across the temple when she'd tried to fight back, and her ankle had twisted badly when they'd dragged her from the wagon. Blood trickled down her face from a cut on her cheek where a ring had caught her skin when one of them had struck her. "Help," she called weakly, though she knew there was no one to hear. The road to Tonopah Junction was seldom traveled at this time of evening. "Please, someone." Her vision blurred as tears mingled with the blood on her face. She'd left Boston with such hope. Traveling west to start anew after her father's death had left her with nothing but debts and painful memories. The teaching position waiting for her in Tonopah Junction had seemed like Providence, a chance to build a life on her own terms. Now, as consciousness began to slip away, Josephine wondered if she would die here, alone in the dust, without ever seeing the town that was supposed to be her salvation. The steady rhythm of hoofbeats seemed at first to be a product of her fading awareness. It wasn't until a shadow fell across her face that Josephine realized someone had actually come. "Good Lord," a deep voice muttered above her. "Miss, can you hear me?" She forced her eyes open to find a man kneeling beside her, his face shadowed by the brim of a worn Stetson. The last golden rays of sunlight outlined his broad shoulders as he carefully examined her wounds. "Bandits," she managed to whisper. "3 men. They took everything." "Don't try to talk," he instructed, his voice gentle but firm as he shrugged out of his duster and laid it on the ground beside her. "I'm going to move you and it's going to hurt, but I need to see how bad you're wounded." With surprising tenderness for hands so large and weathered, he eased her onto his coat and began to assess her injuries. Josephine bit back a cry as he carefully probed the gunshot wound in her side. "Bullet went clean through," he said, more to himself than to her. "That's something, at least." He worked quickly, tearing strips from his own shirt to create bandages. His movements were practiced, methodical, suggesting this wasn't the first time he'd treated wounds in the field. As he bound her injured side, Josephine caught glimpses of his face in the fading light, strong jaw darkened by stubble, eyes the color of a summer storm, and a small scar that cut through his right eyebrow. "What's your name, miss?" he asked, clearly trying to keep her conscious as he worked. "Josephine Fletcher," she whispered. "I was coming to teach in Tonopah Junction." A flicker of recognition crossed his features. "The new school teacher. Town's been expecting you." He tied off the bandage around her ribs with a gentle but firm tug. "I'm Yates Blackwood. Most folks call me Yates." "Are you?" "A doctor, Mr. Blackwood?" she asked, the words coming with difficulty through her parched lips. A brief smile softened his face. "No, madam, just a rancher who's seen his share of trouble." He moved to examine the gash on her temple. "Though I did serve as a field medic during the war." The cool touch of a damp cloth against her forehead made her realize he'd retrieved his canteen. He cleaned the blood from her face with careful strokes, his attention shifting to the cut on her cheek. "This'll need stitches," he said with a frown, "and that ankle's swelling badly." He sat back on his heels, surveying her condition. "You're in no shape to ride and nightfall's coming fast. We need shelter." Josephine tried to focus on his face, but darkness was creeping in at the edges of her vision. "My wagon. Axle's broken," Yates replied, following her gaze to the overturned vehicle, "and your team's gone." He gathered her possessions that were scattered across the ground, stuffing what he could salvage into a single bag. "I'm going to build a fire first, then see what I can do about getting us some better shelter for the night." As he worked to gather wood, Josephine fought against the waves of pain and exhaustion threatening to pull her under. She watched through half-lidded eyes as Yates built a small fire, the flames casting dancing shadows across his concentrated face. There was something reassuring about his quiet competence, the way he moved with purpose and precision. Once the fire was crackling steadily, he returned to her side. "I need to get you somewhere safer than the open road. My horse can carry us both, but it's going to be painful for you." Josephine nodded weakly, understanding there was no alternative. With gentle efficiency, Yates wrapped her in his duster before carefully lifting her in his arms. Despite his evident effort to be gentle, pain shot through her body, forcing a small cry from her lips. "I'm sorry," he murmured. "Just hold on a little longer." She felt herself being settled onto the saddle of a sturdy chestnut gelding, then Yates mounted behind her, one arm securing her against his chest as he took the reins with his free hand. "There's an old line shack about half a mile from here," he explained as they set off at a careful walk. "It's not much, but it'll give us shelter for the night." The rhythmic sway of the horse's gait sent fresh waves of pain through Josephine's wounded body, but she gritted her teeth against it. The solid presence of the cowboy behind her was strangely comforting, his arm around her waist careful to avoid her injury. "Stay with me, Miss Fletcher," Yates urged when she sagged against him. "Talk to me. Tell me about Boston. How did you know I'm from Boston?" she asked, her voice barely audible over the sound of the horse's hooves. "Your accent," he replied. "And the mayor mentioned the new teacher was coming from back east." Josephine tried to focus on his questions, describing the tall houses and cobblestone streets of her hometown as they rode. The effort of speaking kept her conscious, though her words increasingly slurred together as blood loss and shock took their toll. By the time they reached the line shack, a simple one-room structure nestled against a rocky outcropping, Josephine was barely clinging to consciousness. Yates dismounted first, then carefully lifted her from the saddle. The interior of the shack was dusty but dry, with a small stone fireplace along one wall and a narrow cot in the corner. Yates laid her gently on the cot, then quickly set about starting a fire in the hearth. As warmth gradually filled the small space, he returned to her side with a better light to examine her wounds more thoroughly. "I need to clean that bullet wound properly," he explained, rolling up his sleeves. "And see to that cut on your face. It's going to hurt, Miss Fletcher." "Josephine," she whispered. "Please, call me Josephine." A hint of a smile touched his lips. "All right, Josephine, I'll be as gentle as I can." True to his word, his hands were steady and careful as he cleaned her wounds with water he'd heated over the fire, but nothing could prevent the pain that came with proper treatment. By the time he finished stitching the gash on her cheek with needle and thread from a small kit he carried, tears were streaming silently down her face. "You're doing well," he encouraged her, his voice low and reassuring. "Most men I've patched up weren't half as brave." The compliment warmed something inside her, despite the pain. As he wrapped fresh bandages around her middle, Josephine studied his face in the firelight. There was a gentleness to his expression that belied the weathered exterior, a kindness in those storm-gray eyes that made her feel safe despite the dire circumstances. "Thank you," she whispered when he'd finished. "You saved my life." Yates shook his head slightly. "Don't thank me yet. You're not out of danger." He offered her water from his canteen. "You've lost a lot of blood, and there's always risk of fever with gunshot wounds." As if his words had conjured it, Josephine felt a chill settle into her bones despite the fire's warmth. Yates noticed immediately, placing his palm against her forehead with a frown. "You're starting to burn up," he murmured. "Try to rest. I'll keep watch." Rest came in fitful bursts for Josephine that night, her fever rising as darkness deepened outside the small shack. Through the haze of pain and delirium, she was aware of Yates's constant presence, the cool cloth he pressed against her forehead, the water he helped her sip, the low, reassuring murmur of his voice when nightmares made her cry out. Once she opened her eyes to find him sitting beside the cot, his features softened by firelight as he gently bathed her face with cool water. "You should rest too," she whispered, her voice hoarse. Surprise flickered across his face before he smiled. "I will. Don't worry about me." "The bandits," she said suddenly, memory surfacing through the fog of fever. "They took my father's strongbox, all the money I had." "Hush now," he soothed. "We'll worry about that later, focus on healing." Darkness claimed her again, and when next she woke, gray dawn light filtered through the single small window of the shack. Yates was adding wood to the fire, his broad shoulders silhouetted against the growing flames. He turned as if sensing her gaze, and relief visibly washed over his features when he saw her eyes open. "Your fever broke about an hour ago," he said, crossing to her side. "How do you feel?" "Like I've been trampled by a herd of cattle," Josephine admitted, her voice weak but clearer than it had been the night before. A chuckle rumbled from his chest. "That's about what I'd expect." He helped her sit up slightly, supporting her with a folded blanket behind her back. "Think you can manage some coffee? It's not fancy, but it's hot." The simple kindness nearly undid her. Josephine blinked back tears as she nodded, overwhelmed by the care this stranger had shown her. Yates pretended not to notice her emotion as he poured coffee from a battered pot into a tin cup, allowing her the dignity of composing herself. "I need to ride into town," he said as she sipped the strong brew. "You need a proper doctor, and the sheriff needs to know about those bandits." Panic flared in Josephine's chest at the thought of being left alone. "How far is town from here?" "About 4 miles," Yates answered. "I can be there and back with the doctor in less than 2 hours." His expression softened as he read the fear in her eyes. "I'll leave you my revolver, and there's plenty of water and firewood. You'll be safe." Josephine nodded reluctantly, knowing he was right. "The bandit leader had a scar," she offered. "From his left eye down to his jaw. I would know him anywhere." Yates's expression hardened. "Sounds like Bill Carver. He and his boys have been causing trouble in these parts for months." He checked his pocket watch. "I'll head out now. The sooner I go, the sooner I'll be back." Before leaving, he made sure she was comfortable, leaving water within reach and his Colt revolver on the small table beside the cot. The weight of the weapon felt strange in Josephine's hand when he showed her how to use it, but there was comfort in knowing she had some means of protection. "I'll be back before you know it," he promised, his hand briefly covering hers. "Try to rest." The hours of his absence crawled by with excruciating slowness. Josephine drifted in and out of sleep, each sound from outside the shack jolting her awake with fear that the bandits had returned to finish what they'd started. When hoofbeats finally approached, she gripped the revolver with trembling hands, only relaxing when Yates's familiar voice called out, "It's me, Josephine. I've brought the doctor." Relief made her light-headed as the door swung open to admit Yates, followed by an elderly man carrying a leather medical bag. The doctor, who introduced himself as Samuel Jenkins, was thorough but gentle in his examination, nodding approvingly at Yates's handiwork. "You did well, Blackwood," he said as he rebandaged Josephine's wounds. "Clean field dressing, proper stitches. She'd likely be dead without your help." Yates stood by the fire, his expression unreadable in the shadow of his hat brim. "What's the verdict, Doc?" "The bullet wound is clean, no signs of infection setting in. The ankle's a bad sprain, not broken. Concussion from the blow to her head, but her pupils look good." Jenkins patted Josephine's hand. "You're a lucky young woman, Miss Fletcher. With proper rest, you should recover fully." "Can she be moved?" Yates asked. "The town's expecting her, and she can't stay in this lined shack." The doctor stroked his beard thoughtfully. "Not on horseback, not with that wound, but if we had a wagon with a proper bed." "I've arranged for that," Yates said. "Borrowed Mrs. Wilson's buckboard. It should be arriving with the sheriff any minute now." As if summoned by his words, the sound of another wagon approaching reached them. Soon after, a tall man with a silver star pinned to his vest entered the shack, removing his hat as he stepped inside. "Miss Fletcher," he said, nodding respectfully. "I'm Sheriff Thomas Reeves. Mighty sorry about what happened to you." Josephine acknowledged him with a weak smile. "Have you caught the men who did this?" The sheriff's expression tightened. "Not yet, madam, but we will. Yates here gave me a good description, and we've got men riding out to check all Carver's known hideouts." He glanced at Yates. "Mrs. Wilson's wagon is outside whenever you're ready." Moving Josephine to the wagon was a painful process, despite the care taken by the men. A makeshift bed had been prepared in the back of the buckboard, with quilts and pillows creating a relatively comfortable surface. As Yates lifted her, Josephine couldn't help but notice the gentle strength in his arms, the careful way he cradled her against his chest. "Where will I go?" she asked suddenly, realizing she had no home waiting for her in Tonopah Junction. "The teaching position came with lodging at the schoolhouse, but I don't know if I can manage on my own like this." "That's been arranged," the sheriff said before Yates could respond. "Mrs. Wilson has offered you a room in her boarding house until you're recovered. The town council agreed to cover the cost, seeing as you were injured on your way to take up a position they offered." Relief washed over Josephine. "That's very kind. Please convey my thanks." The journey to town, though slow and careful, was still agonizing for Josephine. Every bump in the road sent fresh pain through her wounded body. Yates rode alongside the wagon, his eyes frequently checking on her, his expression concerned whenever she failed to stifle a gasp of pain. Tonopah Junction revealed itself as a modest but thriving settlement, with a main street lined by wooden buildings in various states of newness and decay. People stopped their activities to watch as the wagon passed, curious faces turning sympathetic when they realized who was being transported. Mrs. Wilson's boarding house stood at the quieter end of the main street, a two-story white clapboard structure with green shutters and a wide front porch. The woman herself waited at the door, a stout, gray-haired matron with kind eyes and capable hands. "Bring her right up to the blue room," she instructed as Yates once again gathered Josephine in his arms. "I've got everything prepared." The blue room proved to be a pleasant chamber on the second floor, with flowered wallpaper and a large four-poster bed covered in clean linens. Sunlight streamed through lace curtains, giving the space a cheerful atmosphere despite the somber circumstances of Josephine's arrival. As Yates gently laid her on the bed, their eyes met briefly, and something unspoken passed between them, a connection forged through the long night of pain and care. "Thank you," Josephine whispered, holding his gaze. "For everything." He nodded once, a hint of color touching his tan cheeks. "I'll check on you tomorrow if that's all right." "I'd like that," she answered softly. After Yates and the sheriff departed, Mrs. Wilson helped Josephine change into a clean nightgown and settled her comfortably in the bed. The older woman proved to be talkative but kind, filling Josephine in on town gossip as she bustled around the room. "That Yates Blackwood is a good man," Mrs. Wilson remarked as she adjusted Josephine's pillows. "Keeps to himself mostly, runs that ranch of his about 5 miles out of town. Been here about 3 years now." She gave Josephine a knowing look. "Handsome too, though I suspect you noticed that despite your condition." Heat rushed to Josephine's face. "He was very kind to me. I owe him my life." Mrs. Wilson patted her hand. "Rest now, dear. You've been through a terrible ordeal." Left alone at last, Josephine sank into the soft comfort of the bed, her body aching but her mind strangely at peace. The image of Yates's face, those storm-gray eyes filled with concern, followed her into sleep. The next days passed in a haze of pain and gradual healing. Dr. Jenkins visited daily to check her wounds, reporting with satisfaction that no infection had taken hold. Mrs. Wilson proved to be an attentive caretaker, bringing nourishing meals and engaging Josephine in conversation to keep her spirits up. True to his word, Yates came to see her the day after her arrival, standing somewhat awkwardly in the doorway of her room with his hat in his hands. There was something endearingly shy about the way this strong, capable man hesitated to enter her chamber, despite Mrs. Wilson's cheerful invitation for him to stop loitering in the hallway like a stray cat. "You look better," he observed, taking the chair Mrs. Wilson placed beside the bed before discreetly withdrawing. Josephine smiled, acutely aware of her tangled hair and the simple nightgown covered by a shawl. "I feel better, thanks to you." They talked for nearly an hour, careful, tentative exchanges that gradually revealed pieces of themselves to each other. Josephine learned that Yates had come west after the war, unable to settle back into his previous life in Pennsylvania after all he'd seen. He'd worked as a cowhand on various ranches before saving enough to buy his own small spread outside Tonopah Junction. "It's not much," he said with a slight shrug. "Couple 100 acres, small herd of cattle, good water source, but it's mine." The pride in his voice as he spoke of his ranch touched something in Josephine. She found herself sharing more of her own story than she'd intended, her father's gambling debts that had left her penniless after his death, the teaching certificate that had been her only means of independence, the desperate hope that had propelled her west. "And now I've arrived with nothing," she concluded, fighting back tears. "The bandits took everything, my money, my clothes, even the books I'd brought for the schoolchildren." Yates's expression hardened. "Sheriff Reeves is still tracking Carver and his men. They won't get away with this. Even if they're caught, I doubt I'll see my possessions again," Josephine said resignedly. "Don't lose hope yet," Yates replied, his voice gentle. "This town looks after its own, and they've already decided you're one of them." His visits became a daily occurrence, something Josephine found herself looking forward to with increasing eagerness. There was a steadiness to Yates that calmed her, a quiet strength that made her feel safe even as she struggled with nightmares of the attack. A week after her arrival in Tonopah Junction, Josephine received an unexpected delegation from the town council. Mayor Harrison, a portly man with an impressive mustache, led the group that crowded into her room, all expressing their outrage at what had happened and their relief at her recovery. "The school can wait until you're fully healed, Miss Fletcher," the mayor assured her. "Your position remains secure." "But how can I teach without books?" Josephine asked. "Everything was stolen." "We've sent for replacements already," Mrs. Parker, the seamstress, piped up. "And I've taken the liberty of starting on a new wardrobe for you. Can't have our teacher without proper attire." Josephine was overwhelmed by their generosity. "I don't know how I'll ever repay you all." "By teaching our children," Mayor Harrison said firmly. "That's all the repayment we need." After the delegation departed, Josephine found herself weeping not from pain or loss, but from gratitude. When Yates arrived for his daily visit and found her with tears streaking her face, alarm flashed across his features. "What happened? Are you in pain?" He was at her side in an instant, his hand hovering uncertainly near hers. "Happy tears," she assured him, impulsively catching his hand. "The people here are so kind." Relief softened his expression. "I told you they would look after you." His hand remained in hers, warm and calloused, neither of them acknowledging the contact that stretched beyond what propriety might allow between such new acquaintances. When he finally pulled away, Josephine felt the loss of his touch like a physical thing. As days turned to weeks, Josephine's strength gradually returned. The bullet wound healed cleanly, though it left a scar that Dr. Jenkins assured her would fade with time. Her ankle strengthened enough to bear weight, allowing her to move around the boarding house with the aid of a cane Mrs. Wilson had produced from some storage closet. Yates continued his daily visits, often bringing small gifts, wildflowers gathered on his ride to town, a book borrowed from the doctor's library, fresh eggs from his ranch. Each visit seemed to linger longer than the last, their conversations deepening as mutual trust grew. Josephine learned about his family back east, parents both gone now, a sister married to a banker in Chicago. He spoke of his time during the war not with glory, but with a quiet sadness that made Josephine want to reach out and smooth the furrow from his brow. In turn, she told him of her childhood in Boston, her mother's early death, her father's descent into gambling and drinking that had eroded their once comfortable life. She described her determination to make her own way, the years of study to earn her teaching certificate, the advertisements for teachers needed in Western territories that had seemed like a beacon of hope. "You're a brave woman, Josephine Fletcher," Yates said one evening as twilight painted the room in soft shadows. "Braver than most men I've known." The admiration in his voice made her cheeks warm. "Not brave enough to fight off those bandits." "You survived," he countered firmly. "And you're rebuilding. That takes more courage than handling a gun." 3 weeks after the attack, Dr. Jenkins declared Josephine well enough to venture outside the boarding house. The prospect of fresh air after weeks of confinement made her almost giddy with anticipation. "Would you allow me to escort you?" Yates asked when she shared the doctor's permission. "Just a short walk down the main street to start building your strength." Josephine accepted eagerly, spending extra time that morning allowing Mrs. Wilson to help her dress in one of the new outfits Mrs. Parker had delivered, a simple blue day dress that complemented her auburn hair and hazel eyes. "My goodness," Mrs. Wilson said with a knowing smile as she pinned Josephine's hair. "Anyone would think you were preparing for a social call rather than a convalescent's first outing." Josephine flushed, but didn't deny the observation. She couldn't help the flutter in her chest at the thought of walking beside Yates in the sunshine, being seen with him in public not as a patient and rescuer, but perhaps as something more. When he arrived to collect her, Yates seemed equally affected by the shift in circumstances. He'd clearly taken pains with his appearance, his usual trail-worn attire replaced by clean trousers, a pressed shirt, and a new-looking vest. His dark hair was neatly combed, though a rebellious lock kept falling across his forehead in a way Josephine found unreasonably charming. "You look beautiful," he said simply when she appeared in the boarding house parlor, the words clearly escaping before he could think better of them. "Thank you," she replied softly, pleased by his obvious admiration. "You look quite handsome yourself." Their walk through town turned into something of a procession, as citizens stopped them repeatedly to introduce themselves to Josephine and inquire after her health. She was touched by the genuine welcome she received, the way people spoke of how eager they were for her to take up her teaching position. "I told you they'd decided you were one of them," Yates murmured as they continued down the street, his arm supporting hers in a way that felt both proper and thrillingly intimate. "I'm beginning to believe I might find a home here after all," Josephine admitted, glancing up at him from beneath her bonnet. Something flickered in his eyes, hope, perhaps, or a reflection of her own growing feelings. "I'm glad to hear that." They paused before the schoolhouse, a modest but sturdy building with a small bell tower perched on its roof. Through the windows, Josephine could see desks arranged in neat rows, a larger desk at the front of the room, and a blackboard spanning the wall. "Would you like to see inside?" Yates asked, noticing her interest. "May we?" "I don't have the key yet," he smiled. In Tonopah Junction, locks are more a suggestion than a requirement. True to his word, the door opened easily when he tried the handle. Stepping into the classroom that was to be her domain, Josephine felt a surge of purpose and possibility. Sunlight streamed through the windows, illuminating motes of dust that danced in the air. The room smelled of chalk and wood polish and potential. "It's perfect," she breathed, moving slowly to touch the teacher's desk, her desk. Yates watched her from near the door, his expression soft. "You were born to do this, weren't you?" she nodded, overcome with emotion. "I've always wanted to teach. To help children discover the world through books and knowledge." She traced the edge of the desk with her fingertips. "When I was recovering, I feared I might have lost this chance forever. Instead, you found it," Yates said, crossing to stand beside her. "Along with people who already care about you." The air between them seemed to thicken, charged with unspoken feelings. Josephine was acutely aware of his nearness, the clean scent of soap and leather that surrounded him, the way his eyes held hers with a question neither of them was quite ready to voice. The moment was broken by the sound of children's laughter outside the window. A group of young boys ran past, chasing a rolling hoop down the street. "Your future pupils," Yates observed with a smile. "Though I hope they show more decorum in class." Josephine laughed, the tension easing between them. Boys will be boys in Boston or Tonopah Junction. Their walk back to the boarding house was slower, Josephine's strength beginning to flag after the exertion. Yates noticed immediately, adjusting his pace to accommodate her and offering his arm for more support. "Perhaps we overdid it for your first outing," he said with concern. "It was worth it," Josephine assured him. "I feel like I've truly arrived now, like I can see my future here taking shape." That evening, alone in her room, Josephine stood before the small mirror and studied her reflection. The cut on her cheek had healed to a thin pink line that would likely fade with time. The bruises had disappeared, and color had returned to her face. She looked like herself again, or perhaps a new version of herself, one forged through violence and rescue and kindness. And then there was Yates. She couldn't deny the growing feeling in her heart when she thought of him, the cowboy who had saved her life and somehow begun to claim a piece of her soul in the process. It was too soon, she told herself. They barely knew each other. And yet, the next day brought unexpected news. Sheriff Reeves arrived at the boarding house with Yates beside him, both men looking grim but satisfied. "We got them," the sheriff announced once they were seated in Josephine's room. Carver and his boys were holed up in an abandoned mining camp near the state line. Josephine's heart raced. "All three of them, all three," Yates confirmed, his eyes watching her carefully. "They're locked in the town jail now, awaiting trial. We recovered some stolen goods," Sheriff Reeves added, "including this." He produced a small brass-bound box from his coat, her father's strongbox. Josephine gasped, reaching for it with trembling hands. "I never thought I'd see this again." "The money's gone," the sheriff said regretfully, "but there were some papers and such still inside." Tears blurred Josephine's vision as she opened the box to find her mother's cameo brooch still nestled within, along with her teaching certificate and the daguerreotype of her parents on their wedding day. These treasures, at least, had been spared. "Thank you," she whispered, clutching the box to her chest. "There's something else," Yates said after the sheriff had departed. He reached into his jacket and withdrew a small leather-bound book. "I found this among the recovered items. I believe it's yours." Josephine recognized her journal, immediately the one in which she'd recorded her thoughts and hopes during the journey west. "Yes," she confirmed, taking it from him with reverence. "Yes, it's mine." Their fingers brushed during the exchange, and neither pulled away immediately. Something shifted between them in that moment, an acknowledgement of the feelings that had been growing since that first night in the line shack. "Josephine," Yates began, his voice low and earnest, "I know we haven't known each other long, but I find myself thinking of you constantly. I care for you more than I should, perhaps, given the circumstances." Her breath caught at his honesty. "I feel the same," she admitted quietly, "though I've tried to tell myself it's too soon." Relief washed over his features. "I don't want to rush you. You're still recovering, still establishing yourself here, but I wanted you to know my feelings are genuine." "As are mine," she assured him, her heart swelling with emotion. They agreed to proceed slowly, afternoon walks when her strength permitted, properly chaperoned visits at the boarding house, a gradual courtship that honored both propriety and the newness of their connection. 2 weeks later, Josephine was deemed well enough by Dr. Jenkins to assume her teaching position. The schoolhouse had been prepared for her arrival, with new books on the shelves and a vase of wildflowers on her desk. Yates's doing, she suspected, recognizing the same yellow blooms he'd brought her during her recovery. Her first day as Tonopah Junction schoolteacher was both exhausting and exhilarating. 15 children of varying ages and abilities filled the small classroom, their faces curious and occasionally mischievous as they sized up their new teacher. By day's end, Josephine was certain she'd found her calling. Despite the challenges, the wide range of education levels, the occasional resistance from boys who thought themselves too grown for schooling, there was a joy in teaching that filled her soul. Yates was waiting outside when she dismissed the children, leaning against a hitching post with that now familiar half-smile that made her heart skip. "How was your first day, Miss Fletcher?" he asked, offering his arm as they began to walk. "Wonderful and terrifying in equal measure," she admitted with a laugh. "I have a 10-year-old who can barely write his letters seated beside a 12-year-old who's already reading Dickens." "You'll manage," he said with confidence. "Those children are lucky to have you." Their courtship progressed with the changing seasons. Summer ripened into a golden autumn, and Josephine found herself fully integrated into the life of Tonopah Junction. She had moved from Mrs. Wilson's boarding house to the small apartment attached to the schoolhouse, creating a cozy home for herself with the modest salary the town provided. Yates visited regularly, always respectful of her reputation as the town's teacher, but increasingly open about his affection. They rode together on weekends. Josephine, on a gentle mare Yates had selected for her from his own stock, exploring the countryside around Tonopah Junction. He showed her his ranch, a modest but well-tended property with a small herd of cattle and a comfortable cabin that he'd built with his own hands. "I have plans to expand," he told her as they sat on his porch one Sunday afternoon, watching the sun sink toward the distant mountains. Another 100 acres to the north would give access to better grazing land. Josephine loved seeing the pride in his eyes when he spoke of his home, the way he described future improvements with such certainty. Sometimes, in quiet moments, she allowed herself to imagine being part of that future, sharing the cabin with him, perhaps adding rooms as a family grew. The trial of Bill Carver and his accomplices came in late October. Josephine testified about the attack, her voice steady as she identified the men who had left her for dead. Yates sat in the courtroom throughout her testimony, his presence lending her strength when memories threatened to overwhelm her. Justice was swift and decisive. The Bandits were sentenced to 15 years in the territorial prison, a verdict that brought closure if not complete healing to Josephine's lingering trauma. "It's over," Yates said as they walked from the courthouse. "They can't hurt you or anyone else now." "Thanks to you," she replied, squeezing his arm gently. "If you hadn't found me that evening—" "But I did," he cut in, unwilling to dwell on what might have been. "And I thank God every day for it." The first snow of winter dusted Tonopah Junction in early December, transforming the town into a scene from a Christmas card. Josephine's students were restless with excitement as the holiday approached, their attention wandering from lessons to the window where fat flakes drifted past. On the last day before the Christmas break, Yates appeared at the schoolhouse just as Josephine was dismissing her pupils. The children greeted him with familiar cheerfulness. He had become a regular visitor to the school, sometimes bringing a calf or foal for impromptu lessons on animal husbandry. "Mr. Blackwood," young Tommy Wilson called out, "are you going to ask Miss Fletcher to marry you for Christmas? Ma says it's about time you did." Mortified laughter bubbled from Josephine as Yates's face flushed crimson beneath his tan. The other children joined in the teasing, their innocent faces alight with the drama of adult romance. "That's quite enough, children," Josephine managed to say through her embarrassment. "Off you go now. Enjoy your holiday." As the last child scampered away through the snow, Josephine turned to Yates with an apologetic smile. "I'm so sorry about that. Children have no filter between their thoughts and their mouths." To her surprise, Yates didn't seem particularly bothered by the incident. In fact, there was a thoughtful expression on his face as he helped her gather her books and papers. "Would it be so terrible," he asked quietly, "if I were to ask you, I mean?" Josephine's heart skipped a beat. "No," she answered honestly, "it wouldn't be terrible at all." His eyes met hers, searching for confirmation of what he'd just heard. "Josephine Fletcher, I've loved you since that first night in the line shack when you bore your pain with such courage. I've tried to court you properly, to give you time to be sure of your feelings. But if you're ready to hear it, I'd like to ask you properly now." Joy bubbled up inside her like a spring. "I'm ready." He took her hands in his expression solemn yet radiant with hope. "Will you marry me? Will you make a life with me, share my home, bear my children if we're so blessed? Will you be my wife, my partner, my heart's companion for all our days?" Tears of happiness spilled down Josephine's cheeks. "Yes, Yates. Yes to all of it." His kiss was gentle at first, reverent, before deepening with the passion they'd both held in check during the months of proper courtship. When they finally parted, breathless and flushed, snow was falling more heavily outside the schoolhouse windows. "When?" he asked simply. Josephine considered. After the winter, when spring comes, that would give us time to prepare. Spring, he agreed, pulling her close again. A new beginning. News of their engagement spread through Tonopah Junction like wildfire, meeting with universal approval. Mrs. Wilson insisted on hosting an engagement dinner at her boarding house, where the couple was toasted by what seemed like the entire town. "To the teacher and the cowboy," Mayor Harrison proclaimed, raising his glass. "A perfect match if ever there was one." Winter passed in a blur of wedding preparations and cozy evenings. Josephine continued teaching, but her free time was increasingly spent at Yates's ranch, planning improvements to the cabin that would make it suitable for married life. He added a second bedroom, enlarged the kitchen, and built a covered porch that wrapped around two sides of the house, all while continuing to run his growing cattle operation. They were married on the first truly warm day in April, with apple blossoms scenting the air and meadowlarks singing in the fields around Tonopah Junction. The entire town turned out for the ceremony, held in the small church on the edge of town. Josephine wore a gown of ivory silk that Mrs. Parker had labored over for months, with the recovered cameo brooch pinned at her throat. When Yates saw her walking down the aisle toward him, the expression on his face was one Josephine knew she would remember until her dying day: pure love, wonder, and gratitude, as if he couldn't quite believe his good fortune. "You are so beautiful," he whispered as she reached him. Sheriff Reeves, who was serving as Yates's best man, nodded in agreement. "Lucky man, Blackwood." The vows they exchanged were traditional but spoken with such genuine emotion that many in the congregation were moved to tears. When the minister finally pronounced them husband and wife, Yates's kiss was both tender and possessive, a promise of the life they would build together. The celebration afterward lasted well into the night, with tables set up in the town square and lanterns strung between buildings. There was dancing and feasting, laughter and a few sentimental tears as the community celebrated not just a marriage but the journey that had brought them to this moment. "To think," Mrs. Wilson said, patting Josephine's hand during a quiet moment, "that something so beautiful could come from such tragedy. When they carried you into my boarding house half dead, I never imagined I'd be dancing at your wedding just months later." "Life has strange paths," Josephine agreed, her eyes finding Yates across the square where he was engaged in conversation with some of the local ranchers. As if sensing her gaze, he looked up and smiled, that special smile that was reserved for her alone. Later that night, after they had retired to the ranch that was now their shared home, Yates carried Josephine across the threshold in the traditional manner, both of them laughing at the slight awkwardness of the gesture. "Welcome home, Mrs. Blackwood," he said, setting her gently on her feet in the cabin that had been transformed by their joint efforts into a true home. "It sounds wonderful when you say it," she replied, reaching up to touch his face. "Mrs. Blackwood." Their first night as husband and wife was everything Josephine had hoped for: tender, passionate, and filled with the deep connection that had been growing between them since that first night when he'd found her wounded and alone. "I love you," she whispered in the darkness afterward, her head pillowed on his chest, his arms tightened around her. "And I love you, more than I have words to express." Spring flowed into summer, and the rhythm of their married life took shape. Josephine continued teaching, riding to and from town each day on the mare Yates had given her as a wedding gift. He expanded his cattle operation, hiring 2 hands to help with the growing herd. Together, they planted a vegetable garden beside the cabin and discussed plans for the future with the easy companionship of 2 people who had found their perfect match. In late summer, when the first signs appeared that their family might be expanding sooner than expected, Josephine waited for the right moment to share the news with Yates. She chose an evening when they were sitting on their porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in vibrant oranges and pinks. "I have something to tell you," she began, her hand finding his where it rested on the arm of his chair. He turned to her, eyebrows raised in question. "What is it?" "Dr. Jenkins confirmed it today. We're going to have a baby, Yates, in early spring." The play of emotions across his face was beautiful to behold, shock giving way to wonder, then pure joy. "A baby," he repeated, as if needing to hear it again to believe it. "We're having a baby," Josephine nodded, tears of happiness gathering in her eyes. "Yes, our child, Yates. Our family is beginning." He was on his knees before her in an instant, his hands gentle on her still flat stomach, his face alight with love and awe. "Thank you," he whispered, pressing a kiss to her belly before looking up at her with shining eyes. "Thank you for this gift." The months that followed were filled with preparations and anticipation. Yates became even more protective, insisting on driving Josephine to and from the schoolhouse once her condition became apparent. The town celebrated the news of the coming baby with typical enthusiasm. Gifts appeared regularly, from handmade blankets to tiny clothing to a beautiful cradle crafted by the town's carpenter. "This child will have more grandparents than any baby has a right to," Yates observed with amused affection as yet another town elder stopped them to offer advice and good wishes. "It's wonderful," Josephine replied, her hand resting on the swell of her belly, "to have so many people who care." Winter settled over Nevada once more, bringing with it shorter days and long evenings by the fire. Josephine continued teaching until Christmas, when the school board insisted she take leave earlier than she'd planned. "We can manage with a substitute until after the baby comes," Mayor Harrison assured her. "You need to rest." The enforced leisure was challenging for Josephine's active mind, but she filled her days preparing for the baby and working on plans for the school's expansion. Tonopah Junction was growing, with new families arriving regularly, drawn by the stable community and prospering ranches in the area. February brought unusually heavy snow, temporarily isolating the ranch from town. Yates kept the paths clear as best he could, but Josephine found herself increasingly housebound as her pregnancy advanced. "I've asked Dr. Jenkins to stay with us for a few days before your time comes," Yates told her one evening as they lay in bed, his hand making gentle circles on her rounded belly. "Just to be safe, with the weather so unpredictable." Josephine covered his hand with hers, touched by his constant care. "That's wise. Though this little one seems content to wait for spring as we planned." The baby, however, had other ideas. 3 nights later, Josephine woke to the unmistakable sensation of her waters breaking, followed shortly by the first contractions. "Yates," she whispered, shaking his shoulder gently. "Yates, it's time." He was instantly alert, his eyes wide in the darkness. "Now, but the doctor won't make it through the snow in time," she finished for him, grimacing as another contraction began. "This baby is coming with or without Dr. Jenkins." The hours that followed tested them both. Yates, drawing on his experience as a field medic and his knowledge of animal births, remained outwardly calm while inwardly terrified. Josephine, despite the increasing pain, found strength she didn't know she possessed. "You're doing beautifully," Yates encouraged her as dawn approached and the labor intensified. "You're the strongest woman I've ever known." When their son finally entered the world just after sunrise, his lusty cry filled the cabin with the most beautiful sound either of them had ever heard. Yates, his hands steady despite his emotion, cleaned the infant before placing him in Josephine's waiting arms. "He's perfect," she whispered, tears streaming down her face as she counted tiny fingers and toes. "Look what we made, Yates." "Perfect," Yates agreed, his voice thick with emotion as he sat beside them on the bed, one arm around Josephine's shoulders, the other hand gently touching his son's dark hair. Just like his mother. They named him Thomas Samuel Blackwood Thomas after Yates's father, Samuel in honor of Dr. Jenkins, who arrived 6 hours after the birth to find mother and child doing remarkably well. "You did a fine job, Blackwood," the doctor said after examining both patients. "Couldn't have done better myself." Yates accepted the compliment with a tired smile, the strain of the night evident in the shadows beneath his eyes. "I had an exceptional patient." News of young Thomas's arrival spread quickly, and despite the snow, visitors began appearing at the ranch within days bearing gifts, offers of help, and heartfelt congratulations. "He has your eyes," Mrs. Wilson declared as she cradled the infant. "But his father's chin, I think." Motherhood came naturally to Josephine. Despite the adjustments and inevitable challenges, she found profound joy in caring for her son. Watching Yates with Thomas was equally heartwarming. The strong cowboy turned gentle father, singing softly to the baby in the evening and proudly showing him the ranch during daily walks once spring arrived. When Thomas was 3 months old, Josephine returned to the schoolhouse, bringing her son with her. A small cradle was installed beside her desk, and the children were enchanted by their teacher's baby, competing for chances to help care for him during lessons. Life settled into a new rhythm different from before, but no less satisfying. The ranch prospered under Yates's careful management, allowing them to hire additional help that freed more of his time for family. Josephine continued teaching, finding new fulfillment in balancing her professional calling with motherhood. They faced challenges, of course a drought that threatened the cattle, a bout of scarlet fever that swept through town but mercifully spared Thomas, the normal tensions that arise between two strong-willed people building a life together. But through it all, the bond that had formed between them that first night on the desert road only strengthened. On the anniversary of the day Yates had found Josephine wounded and alone, they rode together to the site where their story had begun. The broken wagon had long since been cleared away, but both remembered exactly where it had happened. "I still have nightmares sometimes," Josephine admitted as they sat on horseback, looking at the stretch of road. "Not as often now, but they come." Yates reached across to take her hand. "That's to be expected. You survived something terrible. And found something wonderful because of it," she added, squeezing his fingers. "If not for those bandits, I might never have met you." He smiled, the expression softening the strong lines of his face. "I like to think we would have found each other anyway. Some things are just meant to be." As they rode back to their home, where Mrs. Wilson was watching little Thomas for the day, Josephine reflected on the strange turns life could take. From the moment of horror when bandits had left her bleeding in the dust to this, a loving husband, a beautiful child, a community that had embraced her, and work that fulfilled her soul. "What are you thinking about?" Yates asked, noticing her contemplative expression. "How fortunate I am," she replied simply. "How full my heart is." "Even with the scars?" he asked, his eyes gentle as they rested on the faint line that remained on her cheek. "Especially with the scars," Josephine answered. "They remind me of what I've overcome, of how I found you, of how strong we are together." Yates leaned over to kiss her softly before they continued riding toward home, toward the future they were building together in this wild, beautiful land. 2 years later, Thomas welcomed a baby sister, Elizabeth Marie Blackwood, born under much more controlled circumstances with Dr. Jenkins in attendance. The family expanded their home again, adding another bedroom and enlarging the living area to accommodate their growing household. Josephine eventually handed over her teaching position to focus on her own children's education, though she continued to serve on the school board and occasionally substituted when needed. Yates's ranch became one of the most successful in the region, his reputation for fair dealing and quality cattle spreading beyond Nevada's borders. They never forgot how they'd found each other, the violence and fear that had preceded their love story. Each year on that anniversary, they made a private pilgrimage to the spot on the road, a reminder of how precious their life together was, how easily it might never have been. And sometimes, in the quiet evenings after the children were asleep, when they sat together on the porch watching the sun set over the land they loved, Josephine would take Yates's hand and whisper, "Thank you for stopping that day. Thank you for bandaging every wound." His answer was always the same, spoken with the steady devotion that had been his hallmark since the beginning. "Thank you for being strong enough to heal, for giving me the greatest gift of my life, our life together." In the story of Tonopah Junction, theirs became a legend of sorts, the wounded teacher and the cowboy who saved her, building a legacy of love that began with an act of violence transformed through courage and kindness into something beautiful and enduring. They lived that legacy every day in the home they created, the children they raised, the community they helped to build, two people who had found each other at their most vulnerable and discovered in that finding the strength and love that would sustain them through all the seasons of their lives together.